All right, welcome back to Afternoons on Newstalk 770. Well, I know a number of you already have some comments on this next guest and want to weigh in on it, but let me just frame it by talking about what the Catholic bishops of Alberta sent out last week. I want to read to you this clip so that you can understand the framework that we're talking about before I get into introducing my next guest. So the Catholic bishops, it was signed by 6, I believe, including Bishop Fred Henry, who is the bishop locally. And they go on and talk about the need for consultation, the need to protect the most vulnerable, as well as the need to protect the conscience rights of physicians. And here's the comment here. We want to be clear that from a Catholic perspective, the intentional, willful act of killing oneself or another human being is morally wrong. Therefore, no Catholic may advocate for or participate in any way, whether by act or omission, in the intentional killing of another human being, either by assisted suicide or euthanasia. This is a position that is informed not only by our faith and tradition, but also by reason. It is a stance that is commonly shared by other faith groups, medical professionals, and Albertans alike who are opposed to the killing of those most vulnerable. When any life can be taken at will, the dignity of all lives is seriously eroded, and respect for human life in our society as a whole is diminished. Now, joining me to talk about how the Catholics are going to navigate their way through this debate that we have, as well as the edict that just came down from the top members of their clergy, is John Berkman, Associate Professor of Moral Theology at the University of Toronto. Professor Berkman, thanks so much for joining me.
I'm happy to be here. Happy to talk to you.
So I'm a bit perplexed by some of the public reaction to it doesn't surprise me at all that this is the position that the Catholic Church has taken, but I can tell you some of the comments that are already coming in. Some of the comments coming in are, well, there seems highly hypocritical, because it seems like the church does turn a blind eye. For instance, when they're remarrying divorced couples, or even if you look at the pedophile priest scandal that happened in the church as well. Why is it that you would take such a strong stand on this issue when it seems like there have been other issues that haven't gotten the same kind of attention or line drawn in the sand? Can you respond to that before we get into the further discussion about it?
Sure. Well, I don't want to focus on a whole bunch of different issues. I think fundamentally the point is whether you can have a good society where people kill other innocent people. And so I think the bishop is right. He uses a little bit of bishop speak, which is perhaps not the most helpful thing, but that's part of being a bishop. But is it really a good thing for society to allow people to kill other innocent people? I think it's pretty hard to have a good society where the common good of all is concerned about once you allow this.
Let me ask you this, because in a lot of jurisdictions, and I just finished watching a show on the weekend called How to Die in Oregon, because Oregon has had assisted death since 1994. They actually make a mixture available to a patient, and one of the things is it's the patient themselves that has to be able to drink it. They don't inject, they don't have an administration by a doctor in this circumstance. You even actually have to have a friend or family member mix up the elixir for you. So let's take it to that level. What would you say about somebody who wants to be able to take that choice themselves and be able to administer those life-ending drugs themselves?
Are you asking me about anybody or specifically about Catholics?
The Catholics, yeah.
Okay. Well, the first thing I would say about that is that I think it's a very good thing that Oregon doesn't want doctors involved with it. Though actually I don't think that is in fact the case, but assuming that what you were saying is true, I think it's a hugely bad idea to have physicians involved, because one of the absolute central aspects of good health care is trust. And I think you find in jurisdictions, particularly in European countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, the evaluation of physicians and the trust in them goes down. And without trust, health care can't go on well. So I worry that it kind of romanticizes assisted suicide and euthanasia, or gives it a kind of respectability when the Supreme Court just assumes and demands that it should be physicians who are doing this. I see no reason. It's not terribly difficult to kill somebody. Why it is they want physicians doing it.
Let me, so going then on top of that, so let's say, because that's one of the consultations happening right now, is whether physicians should be in the mix at all, or whether they should just be prescribers so that a person would have to take it on their own. I guess then we go to the next level of somebody who has spent their entire life as a good Catholic, going to church every Sunday, taking part in all of the sacraments, and yet they get to the end of their life. And this was the interesting thing about this movie that I saw, is that in all cases it was terminal. It was a matter of they were going to die anyway, and they were going to suffer and be in extreme pain and have low quality of life. Is it fair for somebody who wants to be able to have that last sacrament? Is it fair to say, well, sorry, all of the life that you've lived up to this point doesn't matter. We're not going to do last rites, and you're not going to be able to get buried in a Catholic service. I think that's what a lot of people are struggling with.
Yeah. Well, let me say two things about that. I think the scenario you envision would be a highly unusual one, and would reflect very badly on the medical profession. There's absolutely no reason why any person at the end of their life needs to be in intense suffering. And I think it's problematic and naive, if not manipulative, to suggest that these would be the typical cases. I think they would be extraordinarily rare. And I think it's at least important for us to recognize what will actually be going on in terms of that. But the second thing is, I think fundamentally, if you're going to talk about Catholics, I don't think it's particularly helpful to start with thinking about all these rules and regulations. That's not fundamentally what Catholicism is about. It's about being a disciple of Jesus Christ and following Jesus. And so one has to kind of ask, is killing yourself compatible with what it means to be a follower of Jesus? I mean, the situation you present to somebody who's been a faithful Catholic all their life, I think if they've been a faithful Catholic all their life, this is highly unlikely to enter their mind as something they would want to do, unless they've had pretty bad catechism about what it means to be a Catholic.
Did Jesus say anything about suicide? I just don't know how common it would have been in the day. It certainly seems a lot more common today. Did he talk at all about this at all, or is this just something that has to be interpreted by church leaders?
Oh, no. Suicide, this is the fundamental point that one has to realize, is even though we have good reasons for not criminalizing suicide, lots of good reasons, I don't think we should criminalize suicide, but it's still important to fundamentally recognize it as something that's morally wrong. You know, historically, suicide is simply self-murder, and it was considered just as morally wrong, and still is considered just as morally wrong, as killing somebody else. So, but we have this odd modern notion about somehow we own or possess our bodies and can do whatever we want with them, which is a very peculiarly modern notion, which I don't think anybody actually takes fully seriously. But when you have this kind of notion, it seems incredible that you should not be able to simply do whatever you want with your own body, whether in terms of what you owe to society or the nation or to God or to family. We're inherently social creatures. So, yeah, I think it's important to recognize that suicide, if it is freely chosen, and that's a very important qualifier. One of the things that we've come to recognize in the last century, and even in the last half century, is the extent of a variety of impediments to freely making these choices, whether one is suffering under depression or a variety of other conditions, which really diminishes or takes away one's ability to freely choose. And of course, if one doesn't freely choose suicide, then of course it's not a sin. It's not something you've done wrong. But the irony, of course, is with this euthanasia or assisted suicide law, the whole point is that the person is freely choosing it. Now, of course, whether the requirements for freely choosing under this proposal are appropriate and or similar to the way the church thinks about it, of course, is another matter. But it does raise a problem in that way.
Now, when I was setting this up, I did mention that other faiths like Judaism as well as Islam also are opposed to assisted suicide. I haven't heard what any of the other Christian faiths have come out with, and I wonder if we would expect the other denominations. I wonder if we would expect something quite similar coming from the other denominations. Are the Catholics the first out on this, or do you know what any of the other faiths are saying?
Well, certainly historically, Protestants equally as well as Catholics would have been opposed to Christians. I expect in a contemporary liberal society will, to some extent, be all over the map on it. But, you know, how to think coherently about how a faith has thought about an issue can't be reduced to what any individual thinks. You know, there are lots of Catholics who may think they actually understand the way the tradition thinks and may not. or may claim certain things that Catholicism teaches or doesn't teach. So there's a lot of misconceptions about what Catholic tradition, or for that matter, other traditions think about these issues.
I think I
certainly wouldn't expect universal opposition to this, because I'm not sure you get universal opposition to almost anything from every single group that considers themselves Christian.
So I guess if somebody finds themselves in this position, I guess the choice that they're going to have to make at end of life is whether they're just going to lead out their natural death and be able to get the Catholic last rites, or if they are going to end their life prematurely, that may mean that they're going to preclude being able to have a Catholic service. Is that where this is coming down to? Do you expect that line in the sand to be drawn that clearly?
No, it won't be drawn that clearly. Life is never that simple. There are all kinds of pastoral issues and considerations and complexities. As I was saying, for example, there's certainly the issue of to what extent the person is freely choosing it. But this is an important issue. And one of the things that the Christian tradition, and particularly the Catholic tradition, are concerned about is the notion of scandal, and not what most people think of scandal. What scandal means traditionally is doing something that leads another person to do something wrong. So, for example, in the Gospels, Jesus talks about it is better for you to be attached to a millstone and thrown into the sea than to lead one of these little ones into sin. And so the tradition is concerned about if the church seems to give a wink and a nod to people who make a public scene about killing themselves and in defiance, if the church were to happily give them a funeral and say, oh yeah, that's okay, we're all buddy-buddy even though we didn't really like that, then it tells other people that it's fine too. And that would be wrong.
Yeah.
And that would be misleading people.
John, thanks for giving that context. I appreciate it. It's almost like the Catholics really couldn't come up with any other position when you frame it that way. I appreciate your time today. I'm sorry we are out of time. John Berkman is Associate Professor of Moral Theology with Regis College at the University of Toronto. And prior to retiring home to Canada to teach in Toronto, he also held professorships in Berkeley, California, and Washington, D.C.